Hello there, and Happy New Year. My name is Damir Marusic. I am the executive editor of the American Interest magazine. Richard Aldous is off. Today, we have a special episode of the podcast. Last week, I sat down with my colleague, Aaron Sibarium, to talk with Branko Milanovic, the former head of research at the World Bank, about his new book, Capitalism Alone, and many other things besides. Have a listen. I hope you enjoy. So, welcome, Mr. Milanovic. It's a real pleasure to have you here. I've been a fan for a very long time. Very much, your blog is a terrific read. It's really a thing that I turn to regularly. You're such a I was just talking to a colleague about this the other day. It's the blog itself is you seem unafraid to just follow where your curiosity takes you. And so you have a new book out. And if you could maybe tell us a bit, how did you come to write this book? What was the inspiration for Capitalism Alone?
Well, first, Damir, thank you very much for inviting me. It's obviously a pleasure. We have been in touch on Twitter, and so I know quite a lot about you as well. Let me just say a few words about the blog, because it is, of course, a huge pleasure to me when people like it. But I have to say that it also puts a little bit of a, how should I say, pressure, in the sense that I've been writing this blog essentially for myself, so that actually I make a conscious effort never to think about what other people would say, because I've realized, and of course you guys know that much better as writers, that once you start to basically thinking about the reception of that, it somehow constrains what you're saying. And I really try, actually, when people even give me praise and so on, I see it as a kind of a mixed blessing, because I start thinking, well, should I really please Damir next time when I write my blog? Or is he going to think that I'm a fool? So, but in any case, I'm very happy, of course. Now, why did I write the book is... the book has actually the origin, a twofold origin. First of all, after I finished the previous book, which dealt with global inequality, which was, after all, a topic that I worked on for almost 20 years, I didn't have an obvious thing to write about. But there were two things that I had in mind, but I could not for a long time figure out how to put them together. One was that I actually was puzzled, and I had this as an intellectual problem. I think it is still an intellectual problem, is what is the sort of global historical relevance or importance of communism? In other words, if in 50 years or 100 years we study global history, how are we going to assess communism? Is it like an anomaly, some weird thing which happened and then never came back? What did it respond to, and what did it lead to? And that actually then led me to sort of thinking of its role and redefining it, as you know, in chapter 3, as basically, ironically, having laid the groundwork for the emergence of autochthonous, independent capitalism in the countries that were colonized. So that's a very long definition. It's counterintuitive, because communism comes before capitalism and not the other way around. But I think it's actually reasonably well explained. So that was the first idea. And then, of course, it led me to China. And I've been in the last probably 10 years studying China much more than before. You know, having grown in a communist country and being interested in that, I always knew reasonably well Chinese, Maoist history. But I didn't know at all, actually, the real Chinese history of like 3,000 years. So actually, I brushed up a little bit on that. And then, of course, the second part is that I was becoming more and more aware as I was working before, is that the rising inequality in the West is not simply a problem of rising inequality which should be counteracted by, taxation policy, this or that. I think there is a real danger of a creation of an upper class that controls the political process, reproduces itself, and creates a plutocracy. So there were these two origins, and as you can see, one led to the really discussion of the U.S. liberal capitalism, and the other one to the Chinese political capitalism.
Let me ask you a follow-up on that, because as you said, your work has been on the study of inequality, and as you said, that is one of the themes about the perpetuation of a ruling class. How can you talk a little bit about the role of inequality as you see it in societies? Is there a tolerable level of inequality that is possible? You talk about methods within the liberal meritocratic system, safety valves that keep it going. Is there an upper limit? Is there some societal thing that makes it more tolerable in societies than others? And what concerns you most about inequality?
This is, of course, a very good question. There is obviously no sort of a single level which would be reasonable, which would be good. Let me try to answer it in a rather abstract term. But first of all, I'm actually somebody who is in favor of inequality because a certain degree of inequality is always necessary, first to reward people who are, I suppose, working more or who are, investing better or who are luckier, because very often, we have to admit that very clearly. Actually, that's something, for example, Hayek admits very, willingly in all his writings, is that luck plays an extremely large role, and that's something that we cannot, nor should we try to control. So inequality plays this positive role, which essentially, by making some people richer, allows, of course, the others to become richer, as actually Deng Xiaoping also said. But then I think there are certain points where inequality becomes counterproductive in the sense that it cements an economic and political power. And I think that's where the critique of inequality, which comes from the left wing, seems to me reasonable, because it's a critique of essentially of a creation of what I was saying before, of an upper class. And I do see some tendencies in that direction in the contemporary United States. And I think actually even in the last 20, 30 years, not only has inequality gone up, but I think that intergenerational preservation of that inequality, although it's too early to judge, but that could actually be something that we have to deal with in the next 1 or 2 or 3 generations. So these would be the negative effects of inequality. And obviously in countries like, let's take Brazil, or maybe we'll talk about Chile in a minute, but these are really they can suddenly burst out in the scene where you least expect it. So these would be kind of, my answer, which I know it's not, one would like to have a Gini coefficient of, 0.32 as being the ideal and good for everybody, but obviously that doesn't happen like that.
And so you write in the book that what you call liberal meritocratic capitalism has this systemic tendency towards inequality, but you also say that the same is true, albeit through different causal mechanisms, in the case of political capitalism. Could you just quickly sort of reconstruct those two typologies and explain why it is that they both tend towards a certain kind of inequality in very broad strokes?
It's easier for me to do that for liberal or meritocratic capitalism because I've listed down all, I think, 6 different sort of engines whereby inequality increases. Of course, starting, I will not go through all of them, but actually starting for the rising share of capital in total output, which is an empirical tendency which we've seen in the last 30, 40 years, maybe due to the rising monopolization, maybe due also to the weakening trade unions. There are many other reasons. And then, of course, it percolates through the system through high concentration of capital ownership in the hands of the few, which has been a characteristic of capitalism, of course, for forever. And then, of course, there are other elements like the fact that people marry each other now who are much more similar, and then the fact that also people who are rich in capital tend to be also rich in terms of labor income, which is really a new phenomenon. I just want to mention that because people don't realize we are no longer in a classical capitalism where you had, capitalists who do nothing else. We have really people who are rich now in terms of labor income and capital income. Now, when we come to the political capitalism, my thinking there is not, as I would say, developed as on liberal capitalism, simply because I know it less and the data are not as available, nor is the discussion as kind of common and fertile as it is in the US. But I think actually some of those elements, there was a very nice paper that I quote in the book that I did with a Chinese co-author Li Yang, Croatian co-author Philip Novak, and myself. We look at the evolution of the Chinese upper 5% over the last 25 years. And it's actually very interesting. You basically have total replacement at the top, where you have really professional class and capitalist owners who are now there. Now, what are the structural elements? I see the rising share of capital in total output in China as I see it in the US. That's actually observable in the data. Obviously, that share is underestimated, as it is underestimated here as well. And then what I think is very interesting in political capitalism is the role of corruption. I mentioned that corruption, in my opinion, is an intrinsic element of that system. And that corruption then, of course, percolates, has an impact throughout the income distribution. I think there are nice Chinese data that actually are shown in the book where you see how the level of corruption, actually money out of corruption, rises with the administrative level, which of course makes sense because if you're at the provincial level, you have more power. So obviously the job at the provincial level is more valuable. And secondly, it is always higher when you talk about corruption within CCP, Communist Party apparatus, than within government or business, which again shows you that the real power is within the Communist Party apparatus. So these will be some of the structural features that I see in the case of political capitalism.
So can you talk a little bit? There's a moment when you discuss about when you're talking about liberal meritocratic capitalism, you talk about the sort of the stages of capitalism, the early, the social democratic, and then. Is there, and at a different point, you also talk about this idea, Athens versus Jerusalem, and you say that, if, as pertains to the theory of communism and what role it plays, you said there wouldn't be much of a problem if we were just to dispense with it completely and say that political systems arise and don't. We're not looking for a theory. Do you have a theory of history that you subscribe to? Because it's an interesting thing there. And then we can follow up a bit more about that, because to me what's interesting is about liberal meritocratic systems and then also the more sort of social democratic ones, and whether there's going back and forth between those. So can you talk a little bit about history?
It's an excellent question. It's a very difficult one. I would say that I have an implicit theory, because it is implicit simply in the way that I construct my argument. De facto, my argument is constructing, and particularly when I was talking about the role of communism in global history, is constructed in the sense that I do see some regularities which appear. And but obviously I'm not Karl Marx. I cannot tell you what will be the next stage. But I do think that there are certain how should I say certain improved stages, at least in the last 2 centuries, in not only in the West but actually in global history. But I cannot totally dismiss. I think we would need really to take a much longer view. This sort of basically what Berdyaev calls the non-Jerusalem, or actually rather Greek or Athens, actually Athenian theory, which goes back obviously to Plato with different cycles. But that I think would require really how should I say, an ability to think really way out of the envelope and to be right. Because let's suppose, again, let's take, as I said before, when we think of what would be the role of communism, we really have to think of that, how people in 100 years hence would actually think. In this case, it also could be 100 or 200 years, because it's not impossible with dangers of war, of climate change, or political strife, or exhaustion of the sources of growth, that we might actually have a regressive stage. In which case you can actually, we always wonder when we have this graph which shows this incredible increase of GDP per capita, you always wonder, is it going to continue on this exponential trajectory, or would it actually become a logistic curve, or maybe it would be actually a decline? So, to answer your question, let me try. I do have an implicit theory. This is a theory which actually very much is a stage theory, but I cannot really say that we are at a place where we can basically dismiss a more cyclical sort of Athens type of view of the world.
Again, and Aaron, jump in on this at some point. What we'd like to maybe, what I'd like to ask you about is you live in the States now. You must be following our politics very closely. On the left, this rise of, typified, obviously, Bernie Sanders to a certain extent, but Liz Warren as well. And it's an attempt again, correct me if I'm wrong, but an attempt to sort of move back to a more European social democratic, a softer kind of, to roll back some of the capitalism that you described as liberal meritocratic, and that is endemic to the United States. Is that possible? Do you see that, at least in the sort of stages of non-political capitalism? Do you see that as likely or possible or workable?
I see it as possible, but I'm not sure what likelihood it is. I cannot put percentages, but let me put something which may be kind of a little bit off the wall reflection. I think that we cannot totally exclude the possibility that within the next, again, 20 years or so, the U.S. might end up by being more, quote unquote, socialistic than Europe. And let me try to kind of explain why it might happen. I actually think that some of the excesses of capitalism are actually most prevalent, most obvious in the United States. There is quite a lot of disenchantment with some of these effects, particularly among the young. And I think the end of the Cold War has liberated that kind of left-wing energy in the U.S., which I think was during the Cold War was because of the opposition with the Soviet Union was really constrained. Whereas Europe was always different, and of course the workers' movement was stronger, trade unions were strong and all of that, nor was that dichotomy between us and them as strong as it was in this country. So I would not be totally surprised that more left-wing policies actually happen in the US rather than in Europe, which would be really sort of a change of the relative positions.
Right. So one thing that's interesting, though, is that within the United States, there are different kinds of left-wing proposals. And one of the ones that has gotten a lot of traction and has a lot of historical precedent is this habit some progressives have of saying, well, we'll create a new bureaucracy to regulate or manage. Elizabeth Warren, in particular, with the Accountable Capitalism Act, proposes that we basically create an entirely new federal office that can hand out or deny federal corporate charters for any corporation over $1 billion in value. Given your account of political capitalism, where you say that part of the issue is there's this discretionary bureaucracy which creates systemic incentives for corruption, is there a lesson there for Elizabeth Warren and for these different schools of thought on the left about how best to tame inequality?
Yes, I see your point. I don't know the details of Elizabeth Warren's proposal. And actually, as Damir said, I don't follow American politics. But I have to say that I'm not, now first I live in Europe. Secondly, I've actually now become more interested in Catalonian politics. But I'm not, of course, obsessing with Trump and impeachment and all of that. So I don't know the details. But you're right, that actually the creation of bureaucracy and the use of discretionary power by the bureaucracy is always a danger. On the other hand, we have to also remember that was the argument used a lot against FDR and, against the New Deal. And that was a belief that basically it would lead us, as, for example, later Hayek was saying, road to serfdom and all of that. That was even, as you know, the Supreme Court rejected many of the things from the New Deal. So we do have precedents where it turned out not to have been exactly like that. So it's hard for me to say which way it might go. On the previous question, if I may just go back to this, when we discussed the U.S. and this kind of little bit off the wall idea, let me just put another element which actually would go, I think, in favor of my argument that the U.S. might turn out to be more socialistic in some sense, is the role of immigration. Because despite all the issues that now have been, brought up by Trump and mistreatment of immigrants and deportation, which, by the way, existed under the Obama administration as well, I think that there is a fundamental difference between Europe and the United States. Europe is not a continent used to immigration. It is really kind of, they have accepted lots of them. Now they actually find themselves in a situation that they were not expecting. The U.S., it was not the case. U.S. obviously was essentially created, the United States, not the continent, obviously, was created by immigrants. And I think that resistance to immigration and ability to absorb, the resistance is much less, the ability to absorb is greater. So I just want to finish that. That's one element also in which, in my opinion, would strengthen the right wing in Europe and would not obviously play the same role in the US.
Talk about immigration. I mean, you have an interesting proposal.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about your migration proposal and the demand curve that you draw?
Yeah, that's a very controversial proposal, and I try really to be. It was brought up earlier. It is actually the result of my work for like many years ago when I actually look at global inequality. And when you look at global inequality and you essentially say the following, you ask the following question: how much of my income is determined by the place where I was born or where I am now, and how much is determined by my parental income? And it turns out that these two things really, first, the country you were born gives you about 60% explanatory power of your income. Then the parental income is like another 20%. So 20% only remains for you, globally speaking. Doesn't mean that if you look within the United States, obviously the proportions would be different. I'm talking about the world position that you have. So that obviously then says, okay, well, migration must be a very strong force, first, because you can improve your income tremendously if you come from a poor country, and then secondly, that would be a tremendous support for reduction of global inequality, for equalization of opportunities, all of these good things. So my prior was cosmopolitan. So let's make it all open, and that's why I make an effort in Capitalism alone to start and to explain to the reader my prior is I'm in favor of it, but then there are problems. There is a political problem that people actually, for cultural reasons and sometimes for economic reasons, don't want migration. And then there is also a problem that migration is a little bit different from movement of capital. Movement of capital does change the setup of a country. So capital is not a neutral agent. However, people come, they are even less neutral. People come with cultural cultural backgrounds, opinions, prejudices, whatever you want. So they do change the structure of a society where they go. So having realized all of that, I said, what are we going to end up? Are we going to end up with the other solution, which would be the very opposite of cosmopolitan solution, where we actually say, okay, we are going to shut the doors and not accept anybody? And in a fear of ending to that, that's why I came with this curve, essentially. Other people actually, Vail and Posner had also very similar idea in their book, saying, okay, we should then basically work on the trade-off, assuming that domestic people, are more likely to accept immigrants if they're less likely to share certain good things with them. So they share some of the good things, but not all of them, including no right to citizenship. So that's why the whole idea came of circular migration, of a trade-off between the rights that the migrant gets and the willingness of the domestic population to accept them. So the whole idea is really based on that trade-off. If that trade-off doesn't exist, the idea is dead. But I think if the trade-off actually does exist.
So on the trade-off point, so in order to bring more migrants, you would need to sort of lower the number of rights/benefits you're giving them. If that's the case, could that create a problem at for lower skilled workers, where if the migrants don't have as many rights, it's therefore easier for large firms to exploit them and potentially depress wages for low skilled workers? Could there be you might solve the problem of immigrants in the aggregate, but at the cost of more penalties for lower income people? Is that a potential trade-off?
Not really in my proposal, because for that precise reason, I said actually that there should not be discrimination or difference in treatment at the place of work. So in other words, there is no difference in wages, there is no difference in treatment. However, your point is well taken, because you can have a difference in supply, because these people come, so they increase supply. So indirectly, they could depress the wage, not themselves, right. We could not be able to, I would not be paid one amount and you the second different amount for the same job. However, there will be a supply effect. Now, that supply effect comes anyway, whether you have limited migration or non-limited migration, the supply effect comes, and it might actually affect some groups. But my concern with the trade-off with the curve was actually to placate others who actually may not be directly affected, but they may be affected indirectly because, there are many examples. For example, you talk about, read about the UK. You see that they are disproportionately sensitive. People are disproportionately sensitive to immigrants using health services. Not because they actually use them. They actually use them less than the natives. Right. But they are more noticeable. When you go and wait in a waiting room in England and you see that they are speaking, Romanian or Polish or any other language, you notice them and say, like, why? If they were not here, I would really see a doctor right now. So it's actually that element that I try to to some extent assuage by saying, okay, these would be people who would not have all the rights that you guys have.
Do you see, the with the very concept of citizenship, it's one of those things that in the United States, because it's an immigrant country, the role of citizenship seems to, it's subtly but profoundly different from what it is in European countries. Your proposal, did you see it more targeted for sort of the European crisis of immigration rather than here? I just, it seems to me that at least mentally, it seems sort of hard for Americans, given that there is this idea of under everyone's potentially an American, right? That's part of the American.
I agree with that. And actually, of course, my idea was really mostly motivated by Europe. And I do receive quite a lot of interest from Europeans. For example, in Germany, that was when the previous book, Where Global Inequality, was published, that was one of the main topics that the people asked me about. However, I have to say, it's also a little bit influenced by the American situation. Let me give you the example. There is and I mentioned that in the book. I myself have a green card. That's already created a sub-citizenship because there are certain rights, for example, electoral rights that I don't have. I add those. So there is already gradation in terms of citizenship. It's no longer 0-1. Now, of course, many people go through the green card, that they become citizens and all of that, which would be actually, in my sort of idea, would be precluded. But the green card actually led me to a following thought, is that the advantage of that is that actually it covers a very wide spectrum of people and education levels, skill levels, income level. So you don't have a group of people who are identifiable by their ethnicity, background, or even income. Because as you know, you have people who are in the green card category who are, going from very low skill and low income to people who are maybe like extremely well paid, living, in Silicon Valley, contributing a lot to the American, success or the enterprise or whatever. So it's really, I think, in that sense, this is an easier case to deal with because of the lack of homogeneity of that group. So I'm not sure if I answer your question, but I see the point that actually in the American view of the world and itself, the citizenship or the right to become American is quasi-universal.
Yeah. No, I was just curious about, what you had in mind when you were, the sort of model. Maybe to talk a little bit more about China, because it's a large part of the book, and we've spent a lot of time in the West. How bullish are you on China? It's I think the catastrophe waiting for China has been predicted for decades now. Yeah. And so, of course, right? And as you said, the statistics are murky. We have insight more than ever before, but still, it's not exactly a clear picture. As a model, you talk about obviously, post-colonial road to capitalism out of feudalism. But how much is it? Are you bullish on it as a going forward from what you do know and what you think, and how bullish are you for it to actually be a model that is applicable outside of China? Obviously in variants, but just maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there are I think two questions there, and I addressed them towards the end of the chapter really as two separate questions. The first one is China. How sustainable is the Chinese political and economic system? It has been pretty sort of solid, but I think it has a fundamental, it's brittle in some respect. It does not have, unlike the Indian political system, which I think is extremely sort of flexible. If you take a snapshot on any day in India, you have like, 10 rebellions. It was a famous book by, I think, Naples, who wrote 1,000 rebellions now. And India in any point is actually like that. However, to use Nassim Taleb's terminology, it is not fragile. It is because of the political system, which is democratic and actually was able at any given point in time to accommodate all these different interests. Is not fragile. China might be fragile because it has a very centralized system. So if something doesn't click well in that centralized system, it might lead to a problem. Let me give you an example. I think the case of Bo Xilai was a very interesting one, because if it had gotten out of hand, it could have really produced a dissension at the top. And also, as we all know, China doesn't have a solved problem of succession. This is really not a small issue. That is an issue which has brought empires down. Genghis Khan didn't have a solved problem of succession, then the empire disappeared after 2 generations. So that's I think a big issue. But now, if we assume that it does not sort of lead to a major problem, then I think the system does have, so we go to the second part of the question, is the system really attractive to the rest of the world? And then I think actually the system has some attractive features. It dispenses with certain constraints which in more democratic systems really are organized very often by civil society. Now, we all go kind of nuts, how great the civil society is, but I think we have to be now more realistic after 30 years of NGOs, that many of them are really basically lobbyists in disguise. They don't want to call themselves, lobbyists, but they are de facto lobbyists. And actually Fukuyama does, I think, very good job in his book on actually sort of pointing this out. And then these different lobbyists, or going even to Mansour Olson's idea of essentially sort of different lobbies create the structure within which very little can be eventually done, and you have senescence of the system. So I think that there is a danger that of that happening liberal capitalist system on which the political system can prey and say, well, look, actually it doesn't make sense that you cannot build an airport in 50 years because everybody has to agree. We are going to build it in 5 months. And I think these are the advantage that many countries find. I was told recently, just a small anecdote, I was told that, for example, Egyptian ministers had some meeting with OECD and so on. They all talk they talk the talk. But as soon as the meeting is over, they are actually looking at what the Chinese can offer in terms of money, infrastructural projects, and so on. So it does have certain advantage from China, but it has also the advantage within countries of adopting, like, for example, Ethiopia, I think it's a good example, or Rwanda, adopting the model which would look similar to Chinese.
So it seems like there's a number of different causal mechanisms that could explain this high rate of growth. Is it that the Chinese state invests very well using its kind of discretionary power, or is it that the Chinese state just kind of prevents some of the democratic constraints on capitalism that normally constrain growth, such that both they and potentially even private actors just can operate with more latitude? Like, what exactly is the most salient causal pathway by which political capitalism generates this massive growth?
And just to add, does it have anything to do with the fact that they're starting from such a low level,
of course,
right?
Yes,
so the complexity is not such the management of that.
Absolutely. No, on that question, let me just say, actually, definitely, starting from low point is good for your rate of growth, because obviously you can imitate what others have done and so on. Although it is also true that many countries at a very low point actually have trouble getting off that low point, because then you have catch-22. You say, well, we are poor, there is no saving, there is no investment. So it's not that easy, but once you have done it, yes, I agree. However, you notice that, of course, what is interesting, in the case of China, was that only like 10 or 15 years ago, everybody who was writing about China was saying, look, they have done really very well. They're producing all the toys. You can buy bears and stuff like that. But are they going to really be able to do what Japan and Korea have done, is go to the higher higher value-added production. What China has done recently, we're talking about last decade or so, they have absolutely sort of, jumped one step ahead of that. In other words, as we know now, they're actually among leading, of course, first inventors in terms of patents and all of that, but also going for the technologies where they compete directly with the United States, which is quite extraordinary because that was not the idea that was kind of aired like 10 years ago. We were actually basically saying, are they going to go to a sort of a more developed but still not at the sort of top technology? And that's what they have done. Now, that was, I think, actually a surprise to everybody. Recently, I read that it was actually an interview that I listened to of Daron Acemoglu, and he recognizes this. I'm not a fan of his books, but I actually appreciate very much his willingness to recognize that actually that's not something that he was expecting, because one of his arguments was precisely that if you're not democracy, you cannot innovate, and here that was the opposite. But what are the main structure? What are the main forces of that? I'm not a specialist on Chinese growth. I think that all of these elements that we mentioned have worked, but the ability of the state to focus on certain tasks. Right. Take, for example, that's really another good example, is this extraordinary network of fast trains. Mm-hmm. Now, people tell you, and of course I'm now spent a year in Spain, which actually has also excellent network. These things are never going to generate profit. They're always loss makers, but they generate, which of course the economists know, externalities. For China's existence as a single country, having fast railroad network is absolutely crucially important. And you just look at the graph, China 15 years ago didn't have anything. And I was comparing recently with Russia. Russia has one, fast train between Moscow and St. Petersburg. I've been there. It's not a bad train, but it's one. And China has, I think, 15,000 kilometers. So, and they started zero at like 15 years ago. So that's the difference.
Right. So part of it, implicit in your answer, is that private companies have a disincentive to create, they're not going to create these massive infrastructure projects because they just don't have the profit motive. The state can. So implicit in this argument is a sort of brief for a kind of industrial policy, it seems.
Could be, but I took the example which serves me well because it is really infrastructural investment that private sector will not do. But it could be also that the state, I don't know, as I said, the intricacies of Chinese decision making, but the decision to go for all these technologies, all technologies which have to do with climate change, with, sort of green technologies, artificial intelligence. Clearly, these are the decisions that were made at a high senior level, but they're being implemented with private companies. Now these private companies are private companies, and that's what the argument that I make in my book. However, they are also companies that to some extent, as people have said before, could be seen as custodians of capital. So in other words, because of discretionary power of the state, we know that actually. That's why, of course, many Chinese go to Hong Kong, because they are not quite sure that these companies may not have one day, if something goes wrong, that they might actually not be dispossessed. So, I'm, as I said, I think that there is a role for, as you said, actually for the industrial policy, but it's interesting, it is being implemented through private companies. Mm-hmm. So, the example of railroads is a good one for for something which has large externalities, but there are other things which actually are really done by private companies where they don't have externalities.
So let me ask you, maybe as we wrap up on this, so you're spending some time in Europe, and we've covered a lot of ground. Let me try and maybe wrap some of it together and prompt you for some thoughts. So you have China, the Chinese model. You have the United States with its democratic model. You spoke about India and the sort of democratic, controlled chaos and the sort of stability and anti-fragility of it. How do you look at the European project? on this, and using all of these categories, what is the European project in terms of sort of in the typology that you're describing? It's not exactly this liberal meritocratic thing that is obviously there's more characteristics than the Chinese command model. But as you see it develop, and we just saw the vote about Brexit is happening. You mentioned Catalonia earlier. What's that look like? How does that fit in? And what do you see is happening there?
Going back to what I said about the U.S. kind of maybe becoming more left-wing in the future, I think that Europe is basically Western Europe, and then, of course, also European countries from these that joined, is essentially defined by the real big changes that happened after World War II with social democracy. So despite Thatcherism and actually even Macron now and all of that, the essential fabric, I think, is still social democratic. So that's being sort of eroded here and there. You have austerity measures and all of that, but it is essentially social democratic fabric to a greater extent than the U.S. And I think it is still defined as that. And in that sense, it is a kind of a gentler version of the United States. It has, of course, many sort of obvious advantages that you can see in terms of the, health system. Actually, this is something very obvious. That if you look at the life expectancy of Europeans, it has actually overtaken, not now, but it is really the gap is between the French or Spanish life expectancy and the US life expectancy is increasing, because in the case of the US, it's actually even going down. So this is an obvious effect. And also, I would say, in terms of infrastructure, going back also to the railroads, to the roads and all of that, the fact that the US has not really been investing in public infrastructure for now, not sufficiently, for now several decades, is also showing. So that's what I see as the difference, despite the fact that if you look at per capita income, there was not really a convergence. The convergence kind of ended like 1980s. The gap between the US and like Germany or France is still the same as it was like 30 years ago. Now, how would the European project work? Of course, that's, I think, a big question. I think nobody has an answer. It is a little bit going back to India. It's like a little bit like India. It is in a permanent crisis, but it somehow emerges from this crisis. It doesn't collapse. So there is a certain anti-fragility, I think, to the European project. And so, people might overreact, because if you look at any given point in time, again, you have now every country in Europe practically has a problem. I'm not going to list them all, because, the French have with the Gilets jaunes, Spain has a problem with Catalonia, Germany with AFD, UK has problems within itself and within Europe, Poland has a problem with the Constitutional Accord, and so on. But like India again, is the European Union project really in danger of collapse? I absolutely don't believe that. I think it is going to survive. It's actually survived, so far, and it will continue.
But the interesting thing, just to sort of add on that, it's the decision-making element of it that is fascinating. And this is why I wanted to sort of get your sense on it, right? Because, again, the Chinese model, we were just discussing how easy these things are. And to a certain extent, the United States, yes, there are all these, both democratic and sort of political gridlock that is built into the system in many ways and makes it difficult to both manage complexity and get things done. It seems to me there's a fundamentally different problem in Europe, is that there's almost no executive capacity. There's this completely negotiated process. And obviously, we are still dealing with separate countries, with separate economic histories, separate systems. Is there something new that's perhaps emerges out of this? Or do you see it as, just sort of variations on the themes between the two that you've sort of taught?
It's an interesting going to, I mentioned Fukuyama before, because I've read actually both of these books in the last year and a half. And, there are, I think, very important insights, including the insight that actually the European system system at the European level resembles quite a lot the American system because of different sort of checks, inability to actually go through policies, importance of lobbyists, non-transparency in many cases. But of course, the European system to some extent is more cumbersome because the nation states have more of a role than states in the US. So it is a very, very cumbersome mechanism of decision making, but it does have results which are which are really quite extraordinary. Not only that it banished the war, the war obviously is unthinkable. Spain is not going to attack France, so it's actually unthinkable. But there are also many other things, including portability, for example, of pension rights, free movement of labor, movement of goods, services. There are many ironies, but Europe is full of ironies. We will now have the European Union where English language would de facto not exist, but everything will be conducted in English. So you would have the situation of Latin, which remains, but nobody really speaks it. So that's what will happen. But Europe is full of these contradictions. I'm not a huge fan. I'm from Serbia myself originally, and I'm actually quite Eurosceptic when I talk about the likelihood of those countries being accepted in the European Union. But I do actually, so I'm not kind of, starry-eyed, like seeing the European Union as some, ideal, which is sort of incredible. But it is definitely a very successful project, and I think it's a project that would remain.
We've been talking a lot about economic institutions and how economic incentives shape policy. Towards the end of the book, you also talk about the role of culture as necessary to justify the entire system and a certain set of legitimating values. Could you explore those for a minute, and also, in particular, talk about how those values manifest in different contexts and how they operate in, say, political versus liberal meritocratic capitalism? Because it doesn't seem like it's all quite the same culture.
Yeah, what I actually wanted to say there in that last chapter, which I think is an interesting chapter because it led me also to the area that is really a little bit out of my comfort zone. It's about the value systems, and I, of course, use there Adam Smith a lot, and I thought later that it is not accidental that we really have to go a lot to Adam Smith, because the essential problems that he has written about and noticed at the inception of capitalism as a mode of production have been, to some extent, I'm not saying they've been totally forgotten, but they have been overwhelmed by the number of events which happened, because we had World War I, then we had rise of communism, then we had World War II, then we had all these issues where, of course, capitalism changed dramatically. And to some extent, we are now back to capitalism alone, in the sense that actually there is no other system, and we go back to the problems that were really discussed at that time. And I think that what it leads us to is to look at the value system that capitalism promotes. And that's where I'm actually a little bit pessimistic, because I think with the death of religion and with the emphasis on acquisition of wealth, which is sort of intrinsic to capitalism, the way that corruption is intrinsic to people, to political capitalism. We have really intrinsic scheme of values, of levels, where basically we may not always accept that, but basically our worth is determined by our money. And actually in English language, you say, how much is he worth? This is really moving from the value system to the system of purely, how much money you have. And I think that system then, with capitalism, which goes into commodification of new areas, leads to the situation which is from the moral perspective becomes sort of difficult, that we cannot have a sort of the value system promoted by by capitalism is such that that actually justifies the perpetuation of the system, but the value system itself is not something that we can actually feel very comfortable with, because it really, that's why I said inevitable amorality of capitalism. It's not immorality, obviously, it's amorality. So that I think it led me to that to the importance of culture, because goes back to Max Weber, that culture is one of these elements that then constrain your actions.
Right. On that point,
or religion in this case, yeah.
On that point, Fukuyama talks a lot about how Asian countries have a long history of bureaucratic autonomy, and how bureaucracies kind of have evolved these both formal and informal mechanisms of self-policing that kind of enabled them to deal with corruption historically, not eradicate it, but deal with it. So your argument that political capitalism has these incentives that lead to corruption, to what extent, though, does that argument kind of presuppose a particular moral or cultural psychology that may not be there, or not be there to the same degree in these Asian countries that have such a tradition of kind of bureaucratic management and restraining themselves?
Yeah, I don't know. Of course, you might have in mind Singapore, for example.
Yeah,
yes,
that's
really,
a
clean government, and but there are, of course, many elements in Singapore which I think actually could be imitated. For example, take the United States. I mean, payments, I always say that to my American friends, and of course nobody's in favor of that, but in reality it's self-destructive to have payments of the bureaucracy which are way below what you can make in the private sector. And that was one of the first things that actually Singapore did. If you look, I mean, the US system, bureaucratic system, is determined by how much the president is paid. But that has not changed in ages. And then I was recently looking at the payments, for example, of very senior people. I think there was an article somewhere recently. And these senior people, and I know when I was working in the World Bank, the senior people are paid like in ministerial cabinet level, like what directors of a bureaucracy are paid. And what, for example, the European Union at that much lower level are paid. It is really self-destructive, because of course then what happens is that you have not direct corruption, because you don't get money under the table necessarily, but de facto corruption, where you actually you stay for a while in the government and acquire all the networking, as what people say with many schools is the case as well now, and then you go out there and of course you make money out of that networking. So I think in that sense, what I want to say is that in the case of Singapore, it doesn't seem to me that it was a cultural thing. Yeah. It seems to me they're really economic incentives, because if you look at China has traditionally been, and it's now still very much considered a corrupt country at all levels. And so it's not really that they are culturally sort of non-corrupt.
Right. Maybe last question on culture. One other thing you talk about in the book is how in the liberal meritocratic model, people think that they have earned their status, even though a lot of this stuff really is just due to inherited endowments that are unchosen. And there have been a lot of debates recently in the United States about meritocracy and its pitfalls. Could you just talk a little bit about that and sort of the problems with an over-meritocratized culture?
I think that there is a problem there, because you tend to justify, and that's actually part of hypocrisy, you tend to justify any income or any position that you have received by believing really that it actually is something that you have earned. It actually represents what your sort of inherent, innate values are. And I like on that always to quote, because it comes to a surprise to people, that actually, for example, people like Hayek really did not have that view. Actually, they view that the point was that the rules of the game have to be observed. But nobody says that the rules of the game would guarantee that the best ones actually are going to win. There will be many cases of accidents, or actually that the rules of the game were such that somebody who theoretically should not have gotten that money got it. And actually, I think that was a very important insight. I think Hayek had number of very important insights. One of them, that kind of who is worth what is really only applicable if you have a hierarchical system that you decide what somebody is worth. So in that sense, I think that actually the element of how should I say, undeserved wealth is quite okay. Now the problem is that the value system and at the level of your own self-perception or self-worth or hypocrisy that the society generates, you might be unwilling at all to accept lack or accidents and try to, of course, explain that by your own sort of worth. And I think this is a little bit of a problem because people have noticed that before, so I'm not the first one, that self-justificatory element in current upper class, which is not unjustified because we know these people work very hard. They actually work, we know that empirically, they work more hours than people from middle classes. But they tend to be self-justificatory and then might lead to them actually taking all the power and not really being even aware of that. You know, there are politicians, I don't want to name them, but there are politicians who are actually very much fit that mold.
Branko, thank you so much for your time. This was really a treat. Again, everyone, really encourage you to read Branko Milanovic's new book, Capitalism Alone, and hope to have you back here with us again soon.
It was really a pleasure. It was not easy. You guys had really tough questions, but it was really a pleasure actually talking.
No, this was great.
Great. Thanks a lot.